But we're on Daf Samach Dalid Omid Beis, in the middle of the Daf, and we're up to Taner Rabbanan. Now, you may recall that the last thing we studied, just to remind you, was Machlokas Abai v'Rava about Ne'ilas Hadlosas. The Azara became locked in order to guarantee that not too many people will enter into the Azara in Erev Pesach in the afternoon when they're bringing their korbanos. Did that happen automatically, as Abai would have it, and it was miraculous? Or, as Rav would have it, the Kohen was in charge of deciding when it's time to put up the barriers and lock the gates? And again, whether it's miraculous or it's a human activity, certainly it guarantees that there shouldn't be too many people in the Azara at the same time. We learned in the Bryce. Now let's see if we all have the place. We are in the middle of the wide lines, or I say the first third of the wide lines. You'll see a line that begins with Ubiyiras Chet. Do you see that? Okay. That whole Gemara about Yiras Chet was about a Tana by the name of Akavya ben Malolel, and there was a discrepancy about whether he was put into Nidui. And the reason they thought that he was put into Nidui, according to the Havamin of the Gemara, is because of the case of a Shifcha, whether or not a Shifcha is subject to the law of Sota. And Shmaya Vatalion had paskin that even a Shifcha is included in the law of Sota. And Akavi ben Malal made what seems to be a little bit of a disparaging comment. And he says that, as if to say, the Shmaya Vatalion were paskining because they themselves were Gerim, and a Shifcha Knanis, when she becomes a Shifcha, she also undergoes Geris. Kitzur Maisa, the Gemara says that I will, dramatize how great of a person Akavi Memalal was, that when they locked the gates of the Azara, there was no one inside the Azara who came to the toenails of Akavi Memalal in Yiras Chet and in Chachma. It's impossible that they put him into Nidui. And again, according to Abaye, it means that the winds came down from heaven to blow the gates closed. And according to Rava, one of the Kohanim was in charge of locking the gates. Was there ever a tragedy in the Azor because of an overflow of people? Taner Rabbanan, may olam lo nismaich odem b'Azor chutz mi Pesach echad shehoya b'mei Hillel. So the Gemara quotes a brisa with a historical comment that there was, at the time of Hillel, an incident in which someone was trampled inside. He was crushed inside the Azor. There were too many people inside the Azor. Some elderly person was crushed. Pesach ma'uchen. The word ma'uchen comes from the word nismaich, that he was crushed. They called it the Pesach of the crushed. Now I have here a very long paragraph in the footnote. Who was this zaken that was crushed in the Azor? Now, some of this is way beyond my capacity. I've heard of the concept of Gilgulei Neshamos. The Arizal is famous for this, but it was another great Achron by the name of the Ramah Mipanau, and he also wrote a book about Gilgulei Neshamos. And in his book, he writes that this Zaken was a Gilgul of the Sar HaOfim at the time of Yosef. And the Sarah Ophim represents, according to the Ramomi Panau, a Besora Ra, some terrible evil, because as you know, the Sarah Ophim was put to death, or guilty as accused. Now, there's another person who picks up this same neshama later on in history, and that's the shlish of Elisha Navi. What happens is Elisha gives a nevuah, he prophesizes that the Ra'av in Shomron is going to come to an end. And this fellow, who was the shlish, and he was in charge of various administrative roles, he denied the nevuah of Elisha. And he claimed that the Jewish people were evil, and God would not bring upon a miracle to end the famine. And this you'll find in Malachim Beis, chapter 7. Vayan ashlish es ish alokim, vayomer v'hinei Hashem asa arbos v'shamayim hayeh kidavar hazeh. God created all the firmaments, and no rain is going to come down. He simply contradicted Elisha Navi. Ubekach shomer ashlish arubos v'shamayim, k'mo shenemar b'mabul. In the Mabul, it says that the Arubos Hashamayim niftachu, they became open when the floods came down. All this is called levaser ra. It's categoria. It's prosecution against the Jewish people. Elisha says to him, "Hincha ra beinecha umisham lo tochal." You will see the waters come down, but you will not live to eat from the plenty that will grow in the land of Israel. And then the pasuk says, "Vayihi lochem," exactly as Elisha predicted it. It came to pass, and this shalish who denied, based on his absolute condemnation of Klal Yisrael, the nevuah of Elisha, he was crushed to death. And the pasuk says, "Vayirmesu oso ha'am b'shar vayamos." He was crushed to death. Kmochein ha'isa'eno shel oso zoken. That zoken who was crushed in the Azara on that infamous Pesach. Hayara eno shel oso zoken ra. And what happens is, again, this is a segue into the next Gemara about the Kohen Gadol at the time of Agrippas. We'll get to this. Has to do with a census, taking the numbers of Klal Yisrael. Now, you and I might think that what's so bad about a census, but it's not. It's not a good thing. It has to do with when we are aware of numbers, then other nations give us an ayin hara. Now this zaken came into the Azara, and he saw how overwhelmingly flowing it was with people who were all eager to bring their korban pesach. So he gave them an ayin hara. Whenever whenever the Jewish people appear in multiple numbers, there's always a chash, especially if we count them, of ayin hara. And here on Erev Pesach, because the myriads of Jews who are now flooded inside the Azara, this Zaken, who was a Gilgal Neshama, the Shalish, who didn't believe in Klal Yisrael, and of the Sarah Ophim, who was a Mavaser Ra, this Zaken became like an Ayin Ra, and he died. Now Agrippas is a very, very ambiguous figure in Jewish history. He was a descendant of Hurdus, and he was part Jewish, part not. And he took over the Malchus of Klal Yisrael, what we call Bizroa, by the power of his fist. And he was not, according to Jewish law, Roi, fit to be a king. And we had a lot of sorrows from Agrippas. I mean, there were other parts of his life that were positive. But anyway, Pamachas Bikesh Agrippas Hamelch Litain Eno B'chlutzei Yisrael. Now, he wanted to know by census how many Jews were alive at that time. Now, this language of Litain Enov B'chlutzei Yisrael, why didn't it just say Bikesh Leda Minyan Yisrael? What's Litain Enov? And he says that we have a rule that when you put your eye on someone, that's dangerous, but it could be an ayin tova. There's an ayin ra, and there's an ayin tova. An ayin tova brings bracha, and ayin ra brings the opposite. So he quotes the Achronim who say that when a tzaddik puts an ayin on somebody or on some group, then nesinas ayin shel tzaddik litova umashpia bracha ulehepach. In the reverse, if it's a nesinas ayin of a rasha, then it brings klol. And he says that in the Gemara Moed Katan Daf Yud Zayin, the Gemara establishes that whenever it says in Shas, which is a refrain regarding Chachamim of Yisrael, it says Nosnu Einehem, it always means one of two things. Either it means a bracha, or Chas v'shalom, it could be they zapped him and he died, or he became a poor person. That's the koach of Einehem Shel Chachmei Yisrael. Now here the Brisa says, Bikesh, with regard to Agrippas, Bikesh Litain Eno. Now I thought that Bikesh Litain Eno meant L'ra'ah. He says no. Sherotza Agrippa shetochul aleim bracha al yidei sheyeda misparam uminyanam. It's really interesting that taking a census, according to this, in the context that we're learning about Agrippas, is for the purpose of a bracha. In other words, Cain Yirbu kind of thing. It's the multitudes of Jews. We want to count them, and we want to say, oh, halavai, there should be more. And he's judging Agrippas favorably. And the Nosnu Eineim here in our Gemara, which Nosnu Einov in the singular, is the same as an Asinas Ayin Shel Tzadik Litova for a bracha. And the reason why he believes that in this context Agrippas was doing what Agrippas thought was the right thing is because we'll see that the Kohen Gadol went along with this. Now it's interesting. How do you take a census of the Jewish people? When do you find the masses of Jewish people available so that we can count them? And the answer is, says Agrippas, on the 14th of Nisan, in the afternoon, in the Azara. That's where you're going to be able to take a census. My father, Zichron Livracha, used to always say in the name of what was his name? Oh, just skip my mind for a second. Anyway, I'll remember it in a second. That he would say that back in the day in Europe, if you wanted to take a census of the Jewish people in any particular town, for example, you would ask the butchers. They would tell you exactly how many families were ordering kosher meat. But this rabbi, he was originally in Belgium. Give me a second, if you don't mind. It's too high up for me to get it. Anyway, his name was Amiel. I don't know if you heard of him. And he wrote a famous book called Drashos El Amni. And he was the chief rabbi before the state was established. He was originally in Belgium. And he would say already in his time, unfortunately, you could no longer take a census by asking the butcher. There were too many Jews who were not ordering kosher meat. But he says we had a way of taking a census. We went to the Chevra Kadisha, and we could mathematically calculate, depending on how many people were buried that day, that year, how many Jews there were in the town. Because no Jew, even if he ate treif meat, would be buried in a non-Jewish cemetery. My father used to say, unfortunately, today, you can't even go to the Chevra Kadisha. It's horrible what's going on today, especially in America.
What's the name of that rabbi?
Amiel.
With an M? Amiel?
Yeah. I mean, I know it in Hebrew. Ayin Mem Yud, Aleph Lamed. Amiel.
Okay.
His first name, I think, if I remember correctly, was Avigdor. If I had a ladder, I could get it for you. But, I had a flood here, so it's very hard to get access to any Sfarim.
He was the chief rabbi of Belgium?
I think so. And then he became chief rabbi. There was an election. He ran against my Rebbe, Rav Soloveitchik, for the position of chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And he became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv.
Pre-state.
Pre-state. Yeah, you're talking the 1940s, early 40s. He was a great darshan. He wrote another 3-volume work called Hamidot L'Cheker Halacha. It's murder to try to understand that. Anyway, so how do you take a census back at the time of the Beis HaMikdash and the Kohen Gadol? What is the one single day when all the Jews come out, in their numbers and gather in one place? And that's Erev Pesach in the afternoon. Every Jew came to bring his korban Pesach. Can't wait till that happens again. Amalei Kohen Gadol. So Agrippas turns to the Kohen Gadol and he says, "Tein einecha b'Pesachim." Now, the right girsa here, my humble opinion, is the Tosefta. The Tosefta says, "Tnu einechem amalehem likon." You don't have to get the Kohen Gadol involved. Tein einecha b'Pesachim. Count how many different karbanos Pesachim were brought. And we can make an assumption, more or less, I guess, it's, he says, Leficha ein monenes Yisrael, he would not want to count heads. That's a problem if you take a census. Mona es pischeim, that we count the korbanos Pesach, not they themselves. Now, there's a problem here about taking a census because it seems that there is a shita that even if you count something other than bodies, you still don't take a census unless there's a dvar mitzvah. And here, it was a dvar reshus. So he says, "However, he says, since it wasn't an exact count because it was all estimated, we don't know how many people were in the registered in any particular chabura of Korban Pesach. So you could have one Korban Pesach could have 5 people, 5 families, and another would have 10 families. So since it's only a round, rounding it off, that's not an Isur of taking a census. So what did the Kohen do to take a census? Very strange. Not al kulya mikol echad. From every Korban Pesach, he took the kidney, which, by the way, has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. V'nitzu sham shishim ribui zuge kloyos. There were 120,000 kidneys. Right? Shishim ribui is, no, wait a minute. Much more than that. 1.2 million. Right? Because shishim ribui is 600,000. And now he's saying double. So that's 1.2 million. 1.2 million Karbanos Pesach. Kiflayim kiyotze Mitzrayim. Twice the amount of Jews that left Mitzrayim. Many Jews that did not bring the Korban Pesach, for they were excluded. They would bring Pesach Sheni, but now we're counting it during Pesach Rishon. The Kol Pesach uPesach Shlo Nimnu Olav Yosem Yasara Bnei Adam. 10 members of the Chabura was the smallest number. I mentioned 5, but now we're talking about 10, the smallest. So you're multiplying 1.2 million by 10 million. By 10, I'm saying. So that's going to be 0.2 is a fifth times 10 is another 2. So you're talking about 12 million. Not including those who were Tommy B'derech Rechoka. Now, I'm not sure he's including men and women. I'm sorry, women and children. That confuses me. Because we're going to have all sugi about Noshim Rishus L'Korban Pesach. They can join the Chabura, but they're optional. And I have a feeling that he's taught, I can't prove this to you, that he's talking about 10 males. I don't know. Vayukorin also Pesach Me'ubim. Now, interesting, before we had the phrase Pesach Me'uchin. Me'uchin milashon ma'uch, because that old Zaken was crushed to death. Now we use the word Me'ubim. Me'ubim means Am Ra, very thick in number. And now the Gemara asks a number of questions. Not al kuya, habi'inin aktura. Actor, you have to be makter the kidney on the mizbeach. So Gemara answers, the hadar makter lahu. After he counted it up, he went ahead and he was makter. I saw one of the Mefarshim says that when the Kohen Gadol or the Kohen would count the Kulya, he had a second in command, his Shamish, and the Shamish would take a pebble for each Kulya. So they actually counted up the pebbles, because the Kulya had to go on to the Mizbeach. Where it says, Vaksiv vehikti ro, which means that every single Karban requires its own Haktarah. Now here he collects all the Kulyos, Kulya Arev Chalavav Shel Zebazeh, so that after he gathered together all the kulyos and he counted them, all the kloyos, I should say, then he would maktir them one by one. You weren't allowed to be maktir more than one Korban Pesach at a time. You couldn't combine a murim of 2 different karbanos. Well, I still ask the question, Vasanya, we have a brisa that says Viktiram. Right before we had a pasuk that said Viktiro. Now it's Viktiram in the plural. But what does that teach us? Shekulo ki echad, that whatever has to be burnt on the mizbeach, let's say chelev, there are chalavim that have to be burned. Then there's the kulya, right? The kliya, the klaya, as we call it. That also. So we have to take all the emurim and burn them simultaneously on the H for each carbon separately. Now you're telling me that he collected the kulyos and then he was maktir each klaya separately, but he wasn't maktir together with the chalavim, the Avarim that have to be subject to one single Haktara of Emurim. Ella says the Gemara, Tfisa bi alma dishakel minayu. But rather, he grabbed onto the kloya for a very short period of time, and then he would burn the kloya together with the chelev of that carbon. He would only hold on to the clay for a short period of time until he got something in return, and that whatever it was, let's say a small pebble, or he gives an example here of a bean, and then they will count the pebbles or the beans. So this is the Gemara about taking a census of Klal Yisrael, and he says that there were 600,000 times 2 kloyos, kiflayim ki yotze Mitzrayim. So just before I say goodbye to you, I just want to tell you my humble opinion. This is the Gemara that the Bava Rebbe had in mind when he wrote his Kina for the Holocaust. Have you ever read that Kina? If you have the art scroll Kinos, it's fascinating because many people think that the Bava Rebbe must have had some sort of like Ruach HaKodesh to write a Kina. We don't write Kinos. Even the greatest poets and, we don't write Kinos. But the feeling amongst Klal Yisrael was that after the Shoah, there had to be a Kina. And Dafka on Tisha B'Av, because that's the day that we mourn all tragedies in Klal Yisrael. So I don't have it in front of me, but if you take a look at it, and you'll see it at the end of the Art Scroll Kinnis, he speaks about the fact that the destruction was 10 times Yotzei Mitzrayim, because Yotzei Mitzrayim was 600,000 and we lost 6 million. And I have no doubt in my mind, again, I could be wrong, that he got it from this Gemara. That the Gemara says that when they took a census, they would compare it to Yotzei Mitzrayim. And in the Kinos, we always contrast tragedy with Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? The greatest glory in Jewish history was the redemption from Egypt. There's a whole Kina that constantly contrasts Yetzias Mitzrayim with Yetzias Legolus, with the exile. I don't know if you remember that. But in this particular Kina, he talks about the numbers. That the numbers of Yotzei Mitzrayim is 1/10 of the amount that were decimated in the Holocaust. Okay, then. So I don't want to end on a sad note, but hopefully we'll be zocha to the Korban Pesach. That's a good way of counting clocks. Everyone should have a great day.